Clarkson's co-head of the asset-backed group was longtime Moody's analyst Mark Adelson. Adelson was in some ways the opposite of Clarkson, a careful, cautious, somewhat a skeptical analyst. He had been involved in structured finance seemingly forever. As a young lawyer in the 1980s, Adelson had worked on several of the early deals put together by Leo Ranieri and Larry Fink. Perhaps because of his long experience, he was always less willing to accept uncritically many of the arguments made of mortgage-backed securities. When underwriters began reducing their credit enhancement, claiming that the securities had proven themselves with their good performance, Adelson didn't buy it. The fact that an asset class like housing had the fact that an asset class like housing had performed well in the past said nothing about how the same asset very long time. Moody's paid Adelson, for which he would always be grateful, but his skepticism was out of sync with both the market and the new Moody's. My view wasn't the most widely held one at Moody's, he says no. You spend a lot of time doing soul searching when you're looking one way and everyone else is looking the other way. As Clarkson was rapidly promoted, Adelson was eventually moved out of asset-backed securities. In 2001, he quit. There had long been tension between the corporate bond side of Moody's and the structured finance side. Clarkson's ascension signaled that structured finance had won. More than that, the culture of the structured finance faced pressure to issue favorably rating, but Moody's had always baked then when they reside, not anymore. Soon after Clarkson took charge, Moody's began making a point of informing its analysts of the company's market share in various structured products. According to a lawsuit filed in 2010 against Moody's by the state of Connecticut, if Moody's missed out on a deal, the credit analyst involved would be asked to explain why. Please advise the reason for any rating discrepancy vis-a-vis or competitors. Read one email. Michalek, who had a reputation as a stickler, said that Goldman Sachs one request that he not be assigned to its deals. Gary Kidd, the Moody's executive who took the call from Goldman, later testified that he was told that not complying with its request would result in a phone call to one of my superiors. When I started there, I don't think Moody's managers knew that their market share was, says one firm employee. By the peak of subprime, there were regular emails every time Moody's didn't get a deal. Another former managing director says that Clarkson used to tell people, "We're in business and we have to pay attention to market share. If you ignore market share, I'll fire you." When I joined Moody's in late 1997, Mark Freba told investigators an analyst's worst fear was that he would contribute to the assignment of a rating that was wrong, damage Moody's reputation for getting the answer right, and lose his job as a result. When I left Moody's, an analyst's worst fear was that he would do something that would allow him to be singled out for jeopardizing Moody's market share, for impairing Moody's revenue, or for damaging Moody's relationships with its clients and lose his job as a result. In prepared testimony for the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, Clarkson denied that Moody's sacrificed ratings quality in an effort to grow market share. Examples: in August 1996, after Commercial Mortgage Alert noted that Moody's share of commercial mortgage-backed securities was just 14%, largely because it was being tougher in certain areas than S&P for Fitch. Clarkson respond by saying, "It's the right time to take a second look." Moody's market share soon rose to 32%. In 2000, Moody's had 35% of the mortgage-backed securities market, according to Asset Bucket Alert. By the first half of 2001, it had jumped to 59%. Rivals claimed Moody's had lowered its standards, but Clarkson attributed Moody's rise to a reshuffling of his analysts. Several former Moody's executives say that analysts weren't reshuffled. They were fired. Another example, Moody's was initially more conservative on seguration in cases where, in addition to the first line, there was a second line mortgage, but that was a problem because S&P had a different, looser standard. It concluded in 2001 that as long as second line loans were attached to no more than 30% of the mortgage in the pool, it would treat the entire pool as if it didn't have additional risk. The other agencies took the same position shortly thereafter. Richard Bittner, a former subprime lender, later to the financial crisis inquiry commission. He added the rating agencies effectively gave birth to the subprime payback mortgage. Those were subprime mortgages in which the homeowner avoided putting up any cash and got two loans, one for the mortgage itself and another for the down payment. The great advantage issued had in seeking AAA rating is that they rarely need all three agencies to be involved in any one deal. Inventors like having two agencies rate a deal, but nobody cared about having all three involved. So issuers could play the agencies of each other. They didn't really care which rating agencies best taught the rating. All that mattered was the rating itself. The AAA was the brand, not Moody's, says a former Moody's Structured Finance managing director. Like everyone else utilizing Reich's models, the rating agencies use the mathematics of probability theory to arrive at their ratings. A given mortgage bank deal might contain as many as 10,000 mortgages. As every investor is taught, the diversification expressed Reich. So one question was, how diversified were the mortgages? If they all came from California, they were less diversified than if some were from California, some from Idaho, and some from Connecticut. The working assumption was if home price dropped in California, they will remain stable and even keep rising in other parts of the country. The Wall Street terms for spending risks this way, and there are more complex variants in correlation. Correlation is essentially a way of describing, in numerical terms, the likelihood that if one security defaults, others will default in tandem. Zero correlation means that one default will have no effect on anything else in the security. 2000% correlation means that if one defaults, everything else will too. The closer the mortgage bank securities came to zero correlation, the greater the percentage of tranches that could be labeled AAA. Underwriters often added credit enhancements to boost the percentage of AAA tranches. One obvious flaw of this approach is that nowhere in the process was anyone required to conduct real world due diligence about the underlying mortgage. As the SEC later noted, there is no requirement that a rating agency verify the information contained in RMBS loan portfolios present to it for rating. RMBS stands for Residential Mortgage Bank Security. A second problem is that the rating agency models were built on a series of assumptions. One assumption was that if housing price declined, the declines would not be severe. Another was that the housing market in California was indeed uncorrelated with the housing market in Connecticut. And then there was the fact that assumption could be changed if the bankers didn't like the outcome of the analysis, maybe a little rehearing might be in order. For instance, UBC banker Robert Morelli, upon hearing that S&P might be revising its RMBS ratings, sent an email to an S&P analyst. Heard your rating could be 5 notches back of Moody's equivalent, he wrote. Gonna kill your recipes may for use to do modified only. Internally, the rating agencies had a term for this: ratings shopping. Even Clarkson acknowledged that it took place. There is a lot of rating shopping that goes on, he told the Wall Street Journal. Of course, he saw nothing wrong with it. People shop deals all the time. He is rugged. Rating shopping was a classic example of why Alan Greenspan's theory of market discipline didn't work in the real world. The market competition between the rating agencies, which Greenspan assumed would make companies better, actually made them worse. The only way to get market share was to be easier, says Jerome Fons, a longtime Moody's managing director. It was a race to the bottom. A former structured finance executive at Moody's says, no rating agencies could say, we're going to change and be more conservative. You wouldn't be in business for long if you did that. We all understood that. It turns out ratings quality as surprisingly few friends. Moody's chief executive Raymond McDaniel told his board in 2007, ideally competition will be primarily on the basis of rating quality, with a second component of price and a third component of service. Unfortunately, of the three competitive factors, rating quality is proving the least powerful. He added, in some sectors, it actually penalizes quality by awarding ratings mandates based on the lowest credit enhancement need for the highest rating. Just as LDCM exposed the dangers of derivatives in 1998, there also came an early moment when the filings of the rating agencies were exposed for all to see. The moment was December 2001, the day Enron filed for bankruptcy. Although Enron had been faking a portion of its profits for years, and though it had been in precipitous decline since October, when the outlines of its fraudulent practice were first revealed, the rating agencies didn't downgrade the company's debt until 4 days before its collapse. Investors in both Enron's stock and its bonds lost millions. The Enron bankruptcy, quickly followed by similar debacles at WorldCom, Tico, and a handful of other companies, became a huge, ongoing news story. And the fact that the rating agencies had failed to sniff out any of them was a big part of the scandal narrative. Government investors put together the report about the filings of the agencies. The rating agencies were escorted in congressional hearings. Senator Joseph Lieberman said there were dismally lax in their coverage of Enron. At one hearing, the S&P analyst who had covered Enron confessed that he hadn't even read some of the company's financial filings. There was a strong sense that something was going to be done to reform the rating agencies, perhaps to appease Washington and fend off regulation. Moody's agreed to adopt a code of conduct. Among other things, the code stated that the determination of a credit rating will be influenced only by factors relevant to the credit assessment. It also stated that the credit rating Moody's assigns will not be affected by existence of or potential for a business relationship between Moody's and the issuer. In its lawsuit, the state of Connecticut alleged that shortly after Moody's unveiled its code of conduct, two experienced compliance officers were fired and replaced by employees from the structured finance department. The head of the department later complained, My guidance was routinely ignored if that guidance meant making less money. Investigators also allege that during a dinner party after a board meeting, the president of Moody's walked by the head of complaints and said quite loudly, "Hey, how much revenue did complaints bring in this year?" In other words, nothing changed. Not a single analyst at either Moody's or S&P lost his job as a result of missing the Enron fraud. Management stayed the same. Moody's stock price, after a brief tumble, began rising again. The ratings remained embedded in all the rules and regulations. The conflict-ridden business model didn't change. Enron taught them how small the consequences of a bad reputation were, says one firm analyst. The dirty little secret was that nobody really wanted to reform the rating agencies. Investment bankers need to be able to continue cajoling and browbeating the agencies into handing out AAA ratings. Investors want to be able to rely on ratings instead of having to do their own research. Regulators found that in devising rules about risk-taking, using rating was the easiest path. Most of the big inventors, they like ratings to be scapegoats, say Jeremy Fons. They say, "Oh, we do our own analysis, but then when things go bad, well, it's the fault of the credit rating agencies." Or as Clarkson later ranted to other Moody's executives during an international meeting in the fall of 2007, "It's perfect to be able to blame us for everything. By blaming us, you don't have to blame anybody else." Of all the securities whose existence depends on their ability to get a AAA rating, none will become more pervasive or do more damage than collateralist debt obligations or CDOs. CDOs, which had first been invented in the late 1980s but didn't become widely popular until the 2000s, were a kind of asset-backed securities on steroids. A CDO is a collection of just about anything that generates yield: banks loans, junk bonds, emerging market debt, you name it. The higher the yield, the better. Just as with a typical mortgage bank security, the rating agencies will run the CDO's range through their models and declare a large percentage of them AAA. There will also be a BBB or BBB minus slice, which was called the mezzanine portion, as well as an right equity tranche, which got paid only after everyone else had collected their returns. One astonishing fact is that the CDO managers didn't always have to disclose what the securities contained because those contents could change. Even more astonishing, investors didn't seem to care. They would buy CDOs knowing only the broad outline of the loans they contained. So, why were they willing to do so? Because the way they viewed it, they weren't so much buying a security. They were buying a AAA rating. That's why the AAA was so key. Like so many of the other financial products bursting onto the scene, CDOs weren't necessarily a bad idea. Done correctly, they could give investors broad exposure to different kinds of fixed income assets at whatever level of risk they desired. But CDOs were fraught with risks and conflicts. Debts was being used to buy debt. CDO managers were paid a percentage of the money in the CDO, meaning they had an incentive to find stuff to buy, good, bad, or indifferent. Wall Street firms, who usually work hand in glove with the managers, could earn hefty fees. According to one hedge fund manager who became a big investor in CDOs, as much as 40 to 50% of the cash flow generated by the assets in a CDO went to pay the bankers, the CDO manager, the rating agencies, and others who took out fees. What's more, CDOs could also give banks and Wall Street securities firms both the means and the motive to move their worst assets of their balance sheets and into a CDO instead. And since the rating agencies could be count on the rate a big chunk of the CDO AAA, nobody will be the wiser. Is it a surprise to learn that just as the rating agencies had failed to sniff out Huron and WorldCom, they also drastically misjudged the first batch of CDOs? Perhaps not. Sure enough, in 2002 and 2003, the rating agencies were forced to downgrade hundreds of CDOs, in no small part because they contained the bonds and certain companies the agencies had also willfully misjudged. A handful of inventors shoot the CDO managers and the fears that had underwritten them. But because the CDO issuance was still small, neither the lawsuits nor the losses made headlines. For a short while, CDO volume declined. And how did Wall Street respond? By devising a new type of CDO, one that would be backed not by corporate loans, but by mortgage-backed securities. The idea, says one person who was prominent in the CDO business, was that the original rationale for CDOs, loan diversification, had proven to be flawed. But if you bought real estate, he said, you were golden. You were safe. There were a few critical differences between CDOs composed of securitized mortgage and CDOs composed of corporate loans. The former contained not 2 but 3 levels of debt. Instead of merely using debt to buy the debt of a company, CDOs were using debt to buy the debt from a pool of mortgage, which was itself homeowners' debt. A second critical difference was that bonds backed by mortgage generally had higher yields that similarly rate corporate bonds. Defenders of mortgage-backed securities tend to explain away this anomaly once again by claiming that inventors didn't understand mortgage-backed bonds as well as corporate bonds, and thus demand a higher yield for what was really a very safe asset. And to be sure, that was one possibility. Another possibility, though, was that the market understood quite well that mortgage-backed securities were riskier than corporate bonds and was compensating by inciting on a higher yield. Wall Street didn't really care which explanation was correct. All it cared about was that it had discovered an anomaly it could take advantage of. And, oh, didn't it ever? Firms ennobled mortgage-backed bond with the very highest yields they could find and reassemble them into new CDOs. The original bones didn't even have to be AAA. They could be lower rate securities that once reassembled into a new CDO will wind up with as much as 70% of the tranches rate AAA. Ratting, arbitrage, Wall Street call this practice. A more accurate term would have been ratings laundering. Some CDO managers were billing the lowest investment grade tranches of mortgage bank securities they could find and then putting them in new CDOs. Once this started to happen, CDOs became a self-perpetuating machine, like cells that won't stop dividing. From the very beginnings of the mortgage bank securities business, marketers had always had to work hard to find enough investors to buy the lower rated tranche. The triple AS were easy to sell because investors around the globe that were legally confined to conservative investments or didn't want to hold the capital against a higher risk investment embraced their higher yield relative to their super safe rating. The triple B and B minus tranches were a harder sell, with a much smaller universe of potential investors. But once the CDO machinery itself became the buyer of the triple BS, there were suddenly no limits to how big the business could get. CDOs could absorb an infinite supply of triple B rate bonds and then repackage them into AAA securities, which everybody could then buy, banks and pension funds include. It really was alchemy, though of a supply perceived sort. In time, CDOs became by far the buyer of triple B tranches of mortgage bank securities, purchasing and resembling an astonishing 85 to 95% of them at the peak, according to a presentation by Karan P.S. Chava, Bear Stearns structured credit strategist. Among other consequences, this practice helped perpetuate the worst, most dangerous securities because they were the ones that had the highest yield relative to their rating.